What do you take from yesterday, and where does this go now, in your view? Good morning.
Morning, thank you for having me. So,
Thank you.
I think what we were seeing yesterday from Putin was he's setting up to reject this ceasefire proposal, I think, or at the very least, he is playing for time with it because really, at the moment, as things stand in the conflict in Ukraine, he doesn't really have much incentive to agree to it, really. His troops are still making advances. There are still Ukrainian troops on Russian soil in the Kursk region, although they've sort of lost control of the region, the territory that they used to control, Ukrainian troops that had been there since August. There are still Ukrainian troops there. So to freeze the front line as it stands really doesn't isn't really in Putin's benefit. So I think really what we're seeing is him. I think Zelensky is perfectly right. He's too scared to outright reject this ceasefire proposal as it stands. And so by making these maximalist demands, he's making it as hard as possible, basically for Ukraine to also agree to it because he knows that they won't agree to the demands that he's making. So yeah, I think we're in for a hairy ride with this.
For hope not to be dashed, what needs to happen, Lisa?
I think for hope not to be dashed, for one, I think we need to see Trump really row in behind Ukraine. I think a lot of concerns in the West are whether or not Trump is essentially going to sell Ukraine up the river, try and force them to meet these demands that Putin is making, particularly over things like uh, never allowing Ukraine to become a member of NATO, recognizing the territories that Russia has annexed in Ukraine as being legally Russian, those sorts of things. We need Trump to basically come in on Ukraine's side a bit more on this. There's not much hope of this happening. Sort of Pete Hegseth, Marco Rubio and Trump himself have all spoken about parroted lines that are very similar to the demands that Putin is now making. But also, we need Europe to really stand up and play its part, particularly in terms of being ready to have Ukraine's back if this ceasefire does go ahead to police it and make sure that Russia doesn't break it.
Just to expand on that a little bit. You say Europe needs to be ready to play its part. What does that mean?
So I think, for example, Starmer's coalition of the willing that he's been talking about for the past couple of weeks, having sort of this coalition of countries who are ready to send peacekeeping troops to basically monitor any breaks in the ceasefire. The front line, but in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine at the moment is about 200 kilometers long. It's vast, not to mention, of course, sort of the aerial and naval arena of the conflict as well. So that needs to be more or less ready to go, I would imagine, if we're looking at a ceasefire very quickly. Another problem with that, of course, is the fact that Russia is saying that for them, any form of NATO troops in Ukraine observing this peacekeeping process would be a red line. So that's another hurdle to cross. And also just being there ready to send any military or financial aid to Ukraine that it needs.
Lastly, Reuters is reporting that Putin's desires in Ukraine include international recognition of territory that he's captured, limits on the size of Ukraine's army, a ban on Ukraine NATO membership, and no foreign peacekeepers in the country. Well, I doubt that any of those four are attainable, are they, Lisa?
Yeah, exactly. I agree. And I think, I mean, Ukraine, for one, is definitely not going to agree to those demands. We will see whether Trump tries to force Ukraine to agree to these demands. I think this is all part of, I think, Putin's gameplay. By what he's doing by sort of giving these demands as well is flipping back the sort of the blame, as it were, onto Ukraine and basically saying, "Oh, well, we are in theory open to this, but we have a few demands." And now he's basically throwing the ball back to Ukraine's court to see, as they probably will do if they reject it.
Lisa, thank you for your time. That article, is Putin really open to a ceasefire with Ukraine? Lisa Hasseldine is the assistant online editor of The Spectator. 12 after 7. Listening, Stefan Wolf, who's Professor of International Security at the University of Birmingham, joining me now. Perhaps I can pick up with an idea that I discussed with the journalist. Do you think hope is pretty much dashed, Professor? Good morning.
Well, I think hope is pretty much dashed in the short term. I do agree with most of what Lisa just said, but I also think we have to bear in mind here that this is a typical Russian negotiation tactic. They come up with really outrageous, completely unattainable conditions first. And then they make some minor concessions and really sort of move the goalposts just a little bit to look then suddenly much more reasonable. So I think this is really what Putin is playing for. He probably has some ideas where he can move some of his assumed red lines just by a couple of inches and really ultimately get to a deal, because this is what Trump really wants. And for Putin, it's, I think, very important to walk a very fine line here so that he doesn't upset Trump, because the president could flip any minute.
Who is bearing the greater pressure for peace, Professor? Zelensky or Putin?
I think at the moment, really, the ball is in Putin's court, because the way in which Trump has set this up is he probably has developed, or his people have developed, a proposal for a 30-day ceasefire. He has gotten the Ukrainians to agree to it. And I mean, some of the statements that he made yesterday really seem to suggest that he now expects Putin to pretty much agree to what is on the table. Otherwise, the way in which these negotiations, if you can call them that, are set up at the moment, I mean, it's very tedious because Ukraine and Russia are not talking directly to each other. It's an American proposal that they both have to agree to. So it's this endless shuttle diplomacy potentially that will ensue. And I really don't see Trump having the patience or the strategic vision for that.
Which leads me to my final question, Professor. Notoriously difficult to predict the unpredictable, but what might we see from the White House later today?
I think we'll probably have some sort of more engagement planned for the next couple of days. I wouldn't completely rule out that there will be a phone call between Trump and Putin, but I think that will very much depend on how likely the Americans see the chances that they will move the Russians towards a slightly more acceptable position so that they can keep the discussion going.